Raizoon's introduction took nearly 10 minutes to complete, and most of that was because of my propensity for collecting titles. Ulurmak and Olmyra had nearly as many, but I guess that makes sense for the ruler of another nation and a multi-centuries-old vampire. Olmyra looked the same as the last time I'd laid eyes on her, nearly 30 years prior. Leith had a decent number of titles, which is to be expected of his exploits. Conversely, the orcs from the Alta family had barely any titles, and the human didn't have a single one. I struggled not to stare at him for the entire introduction, and succeeded for the most part. A couple of glances here and there managed to wiggle past my self-control, though. The human's an odd-looking thing. His hands and general shape are similar to what I imagine a tall gnome might look like. But that's where the similarities to gnomes end. It has a jawline nearly identical to that of an elf, and some of its teeth look like a drow's. On top of that, its musculature is similar to an orc's, though orcs tend to be a bit larger. The most shocking detail to me, though, is that it also has the round earlobes that you only see in dwarves. I would easily believe that he's an amalgamation of the various races, were it not for the roundness of the top of his ears and his alleged origin. An alien from another world, magically teleported here, parts unknown. Despite his earlier evasiveness, a little pressing had caused Ulurmak to practically gush various facts about the human. A refreshing bit of candor from High Chief See-for-yourself, Ulurmak. The human eats both meat and vegetables, which is odd enough, though I could have guessed at this fact by its teeth. Even odder, though, is that it has thus far leveled up far faster than normal. This could be indicative of either an advanced education or the Kuraguard showing favoritism outside of a royal line for the first time in history. Finally, it had killed a monster that nearly destroyed a team of over 20s. A monster that may have been a corrupted version of its own race. The look on my face at hearing that last fact had caused Ulurmak's caginess to return. I glanced at Leith, who was also studying the human. He had met it before, but desperately wanted to know how it awoke King Isinarath. The dwarven not-quite-spy had practically begged me to allow him to accompany me. In exchange for an unnamed future favor, I had allowed it. Once Raizoon finished his overly long introduction, the four in front of us began their debriefing. I listened in disbelief as they recounted their travels. The story was primarily told by the Alta brothers and the human. Olmyra had joined their party on the latter portion of the journey. The human spoke with an eloquence that could rival that of a duke, but with far less profanity than is typical in my empire. This lent credence to the idea that he had been educated. But by whom? What kind of teacher would educate a being like this without simultaneously turning him into a research project? Despite his eloquence and formalities, though, his story was full of holes and time skips that indicated it was likely trying to hide something. This was further evidenced by Nick wringing his hands when an obvious omission occurred during the narrative. I could tell by the tension slowly creeping into Ulurmak's shoulders that I wasn't the only one who noticed. Once the translators arrived, we made our way back here to report to you, High Chief, the human said. Ulurmak crossed his arms. I confess that I do not know you well, Nick, but I suspect that the events you just elucidated have been heavily redacted. There were some happenings that were not relevant to the mission, Your Greatness, Yulk said, bowing his head. Happenings that are rather sensitive to our charge, I'm afraid. And how am I to know for certain these happenings are irrelevant when I am not to know of what they are? Teasing does not befit one of your station, High Chief, Olmyra the Eternal said, crossing her arms to match Ulurmak's posture. Consider the likelihood that the Altas would endanger the United Chiefdoms. The massive orc and domineering vampire stared at one another for a few moments. I'd argued with the both of them before, but hadn't seen them argue among themselves. I absent-mindedly rubbed the thick golden hoop in my left earlobe as I tried to guess who would give ground first. Everyone else in the room looked as if they'd been shown their graves, though. After a few seemingly tense moments, Ulurmak laughed uproariously, which caused a few flinches. I knew you'd spoil my fun the moment you walked in, Olmyra. She's right, boys. I'm having a bit of levity at your expense, he explained. I am content to let you have your secrets so long as they don't come back to bite me on the rump. They won't, sir. Nick trailed off. Wait, you don't plan to attack the fair folk anytime soon, do you? What? No, Ulermak answered incredulously. First of all, the only fair folk we're aware of are on good terms with us. Second, it would be a damned foolish thing to do, regardless of our relationship with them. They help keep the monster population manageable. Third, how in the hells do you know about the fair folk? The Alta brothers sighed simultaneously whilst the human attempted to fabricate a plausible explanation. The explanation carefully dodged the reasons that the group had met with the fair folk, as well as some of the crucial details that had been discussed during that meeting. The only real detail he gave were the names of the fair folk involved, which caused me to involuntarily snort. Ulermak looked over his shoulder at me. Once he met my gaze, he smirked and rolled his eyes. Then he turned back to Nick and the orcs with a much sterner expression. Well, I've never heard of Algebran or Tits, but Mumuldabran is a name that I know well. It is a representative of the fair folk of the deep wild forest, most of which is within the domain of the unified chiefdoms. Ulormak explained, We have a great many agreements with the fair folk of the deep wild forest. It would not be an exaggeration to say that a threat to them is a threat to us. Well, High Chief, they seemed confident that they have the situation under control, Nick said. That is not for you to decide, but I can see you are determined to keep this secret. Well then, let's try this. Ulurmak clapped his massive hands. Yolk Alta, by the authority of the office of the High Chief of the United Chiefdoms, I hereby order you to tell me of your journey in full, unadulterated detail. Failure to comply will result in your arrest and a punishment of up to 15 years in prison. What about his mom? Leith asked. Oh, she'll understand, Ulurmak said. The Alta clan is mostly law-abiding and very honorable. By refusing this order, Yolk will be breaking the law. She may protest, perhaps even smack me upside the head, but she'll take no action to prevent his incarceration. I understand, sir, Yolk said calmly. I invoke the right of confidence. The right of confidence is an orc law passed by Ulermak's grandfather. It allows one to refuse to answer questions that may compromise the security of the unified chiefdoms in the presence of one who may reveal those secrets to an enemy. My rage was immediate and blinding. What in the hells is that supposed to mean? I demanded. You think I can't be trusted with your little secrets? I'm an emperor. I know secrets that would cause the hair to flee from your head, boy. My apologies for the insult, Emperor. Your Highness is not the reason for my invocation, though. My temper cooled as Yolk looked pointedly at the dwarf to my left. Leith chuckled and stood up, brushing off his pants. Fair enough, he said. I'll see myself out. Hold on, Ulurmak said, holding up a hand. The right of confidence is non-applicable. Leath is an official friend of the unified chiefdoms. If what you're about to say can be said in front of the Emperor, it can be said in front of Leath. No offense, Emperor. Some taken, I growled. But he sells information, Nash argued before realizing his blunder. Before Ulurmak could chastise him, Leath laughed. That I do, Nash, but I've got honor. Of a sort. If a friend swears me to secrecy, it will be a secret that I keep. There was a moment of silence as Yolk contemplated how to proceed. Understood, he finally said. As Leath sat down, Yolk began to tell us what actually happened during their journey. We listened intently to the entirety of the tale of gods and fae in shock. A spark of paranoia lit within me when I learned that Nick is touched, but I quickly quelled it. It isn't as if there's much harm in the gods watching us, and the only methods of trying to prevent their surveillance would only guarantee their ire. The ire of the gods is obviously best avoided at all costs. Still, I didn't feel happy about it. And once the messengers left, we made our way here, Yolk said. Well, I can see why you decided to keep that a secret. Ulurmak uncrossed his arms. However, it is a good thing you told me. I've got an inkling as to who may attack the fair folk, and there might be something we can actually do about it. The Night Kingdom is the most likely culprit. Lofin's dumb enough to try a sneak attack against the fair folk, but he'd likely fail due to the typical incompetency of his armies. The vampires, on the other hand, are crafty enough to succeed, and are likely desperate. There might be indeed, I said, rubbing my chin. All right, I think that's enough, Ulermak said. You four are on your way to Calcuti now, right? Yes, High Chief, Yulk said. Liath, did you come by Hanars or cart? He came by cart. Since I was expecting a fight, I came by Nars, I answered, glaring at the spoiled dwarf. I only know how to drive a Nars, Your Eminence. Liath held up his hands defensively. I've never ridden one before. So you say. It is good that you arrived by cart, Ulermak interrupted. You can depart the same way and give these four a ride into Calcuti, unless the Emperor has an objection. No objections from me. Just keep your noses clean while you're in my country, I said with a wave of my hand. A knock came from the door, and Rezun poked his head in. Ulermak nodded at him. The elves have arrived. General Makiv is waiting to see you. He'll not have to wait long. Yulk, Nash, Olmyra, Nick, and Liath, you're dismissed. Safe journeys. Liath raised an eyebrow but followed the rest out of the room. I sighed, having figured out what's coming next. Simple math, really. We have one dwarven army, an orcish army, an elven army, and a mutual enemy to the north. Rezun entered the office with General Makiv in tow. It had been a long time since I'd seen the elven general, and unlike Olmyra, he had aged. His hair was a lighter color, and there was a slight crinkle around his eyes. It reminded me of my own forthcoming golden years. Introductions won't be necessary this time, Rezun, Ulermak said with a wave of his hand. How are you, Makiv? I'm great. It's been a while since I was on the road, the general said as Rezun left. Wish you'd let him do the intro, though. I've got a new title. Oh? Dragon's General, on account of King Isinirath's awakening. I only just learned about it the other day. Makiv laughed. An excellent title. Well, I assume my messenger told you of the fate of the Drow invasion? Indeed he did. Makiv took a seat. However, my men need fed and watered, so we finished our trek regardless. And since we're here, I had an idea. Lead an invasion into the Night Kingdom and force Lofen into a lasting treaty? I asked with a smirk. Yes, Emperor. I take it you're of a similar mind? No, I'd rather raze that damned country to the ground and split the land evenly amongst us. We can decide what to do with the Night Kingdom's holdings once we beat it, Ulermak chuckled. But first, we have an invasion to plan. I don't fucking get it, Rebus said while rubbing his temples. Isn't this a dead dungeon? Apparently not, Heino replied. Travelers have gone missing nearby, and the only thing the disappearances have in common is tracks that lead back to this dungeon. We stared at the mausoleum that marked the entrance of the Talacum dungeon for a moment. Rebus wasn't wrong. Until a few days ago it had been classified as neutralized and looted. Then some newbie adventurer went looking for his missing cousin and found some blood in a ripped pack, then followed some tracks back here. It's probably for the best that he immediately turned tail and reported it to the Venators Bureau. Our party is contracted to the Venators Bureau and is currently comprised of 5 members. Mako, an orc from the Unified Chiefdoms who's large enough to make a Nahalim pause. Ithrima, an elven sorceress that's been with the party for about half a decade now. Then there's Rebus, Heino, and myself. All 3 of us are dwarves from the western fringe of Calcuti and founding members of our locally famous group, the Western Wasters. I absolutely hate our name. It's supposed to indicate the fact that we originate from the western portion of Calcuti and that we are willing to go into the wastes. To me, the name makes it sound like we're a bunch of drunks. Unfortunately, the one who coined the name died slowly and painfully because of consumption. It was sad enough to make us to stick with the dumbest fucking name of all time. What do you think, Gally? Mako asked. This gonna be an easy one? Bah, I replied. How should I fucking know? Don't got anything to base that kind of judgment off of. Last reported monster in this fucker was kobolds, but kobolds don't do kidnappings. Hell, they don't even like going above ground. Mako shifted, his heavy armor clinking as he hefted his pike casually onto his shoulder. The rest of the party also fidgeted nervously. Nobody liked it when I couldn't tell how dangerous something was gonna be. It's probably just luck, but I've never been wrong. Might also have something to do with the fact I don't venture a guess unless I've got something to go off of. Well, I guess it's not like I've got nothing. A dungeon supposedly filled with lower-tier monsters suddenly becomes a hideout for kidnappers. The entrance to said dungeon is a fucking grave marker, and I can smell death from all the way out here. There's no chance this is gonna be a safe quest. Fuck it, I sighed. I'm gonna say it's probably life-threatening. So let's just do what the Bureau asked and take a peek, yeah? Sounds good to me, Rebus said, attaching his shield to his arm. It's all they're fucking paying us for anyway. Come now, Rebus, Ithrema scolded. We don't do this for the pay. We do this to make things safer for the citizenry of the Empire of Calcuti. Ithrema was the most patriotic of our ragtag group. To her, being an adventurer was a calling, not a job. Can't say that I entirely disagree, but I'm far more concerned with being able to eat than whether or not some fool is sleeping safely in his bed. Listen, bitch, the citizenry of Calcuti is safest when I've got a good brew in my belly, Rebus replied, and it ain't like they're buying, so really, to ensure their safety, they should be paying me loads. You sound like a bandit, Shortstack, she growled. Rebus, Hino, and I began glaring at her once the slur left her mouth. She instantly realized her mistake, and her eyes locked onto the ground. I'm sorry. You're goddamned right you are, Hino said. Gali and I didn't call you a bitch, did we? So what the fuck are you doing using our height as an insult? It's not even a good insult, Mako said. There's a lot of advantages to being dwarf-sized. I said I'm sorry, Ithrema shouted. Fine, I'll change my insult to cousin fucker. You happy? That'll do for me, I said. Yep, Hino nodded. Much better, Mako grinned. Hey, fuck all of you, Rebus scowled. Now, Rebus, we're not your cousins, Ithrema said with a wicked smile. Rebus glared at her for a moment, but couldn't come up with a comeback. Instead, he drew his sword and started angrily marching toward the dungeon. We fucking doing this or not? He asked over his shoulder. The four of us chuckled and started following after him. Hino, who also wields a sword and board, chased after him to share point. Mako took his place between them, not having to run because of his long legs. In his armor, our orc's damn near untouchable head-on. But since he uses a pike, he's vulnerable to attacks from the side. Hino and Rebus cover his flanks with their shields and swords, while Ithrema and I handle ranged attacks and healing when it's needed. It's a tried-and-true formation that's led us safely through many fights. But the moment we crossed the threshold of the dungeon, a knot formed in my gut. The smell of death was almost overpowering now. There's corpses somewhere, and probably a lot of them. Gods, I hate being right. We activated our lights, and I nervously checked my string and quiver. The soft twang of the string echoed in the dungeon, causing me to wince slightly. Everyone else looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I sighed softly at my rookie mistake. We continued forward, and I noticed Ithrema fiddling with her ring. It had been given to her by her husband to mark their engagement, and it became her arcane focus after he was killed by a warg. His death is what made her want to become an adventurer. She only plays with the ring when she's thinking about him, or when she's nervous. It felt good to know that I wasn't the only one. Both the floor and the walls were tiled, apparently by magic. The lack of tool marks was a dead giveaway. Mako started poking the tiles in front of us as we went, and eventually his pike found a trap. Once the trap withdrew, he pointed out which tile was its trigger, and we stepped past it. We didn't get far before Mako stopped again. Damn, that's gross, Mako said softly, poking his spear at something. What is it? I asked. Dead kobolds, Rebus said. Looks like they've been here for a while. Hino held his nose and knelt to get a closer look. They sure have, the flesh is pretty rotten. This one's neck. I could swear that's a handprint. Mako knelt down, took a look, then nodded solemnly. Yeah, that's definitely a handprint. Those ones were cut, though. So, 2 of them. One with a blade and one strong enough to crush a kobold's neck bare-handed. I don't know. Hino held out his hand and compared it to the neck. Pretty sure that's a left hand. Might have been only one attacker, blade in their right hand and grabbing with their left. There's a lot of things that use blades when they don't have to, Rebus added as Hino and Mako stood. Even some adventurers do that. True, Hino shrugged. Guess we still don't know what we're dealing with. With the mystery left unsolved, we continued on, hoping to find more clues as to what we were dealing with. It wasn't long before we did find more clues, but they were in the form of several more groups of kobold bodies. We stopped to examine each one, and our findings grew grimmer as we went. It's like whoever did this was just playing with them, Hino said solemnly. I don't get how you make it through this many kobolds without getting a wound or two that'll make you hesitant. What do you mean? Mako asked. This one's got a spear next to it, but also has a handprint on its neck. Would you try to go hand to hand with someone holding a spear? No. The whole point of a spear is to make people keep their distance. Hold on. This one's got a bite mark on its shoulder, Rebus said. Hino jogged over to him and examined the dead kobold. I fought the temptation to join them. Tell me this isn't what I think it is, Hino. It only looks like that because of the rot, right? Rebus asked. Oh no, Hino replied. What is it? Mako asked. The bulking orc joined the pair of dwarves and examined the corpse. The three of them went uncharacteristically quiet. Ithrima and I shared an annoyed glance. Well, don't keep us in suspense, I growled. The fuck did you find? The three of them stood. There's no doubt about it, Mako said. This is a vampire bite. A vampire? I scoffed. Here? And since when do vampires snack on kobolds? Since when are you a fucking expert on vampires, Gally? Rebus rebutted. Since your mom taught me last night. She sucked just as the Night Kingdom has vamps, Mako interrupted with a sigh. Heard that the chiefdoms were fighting them again this year. Could be one came through the chiefdoms with the Drow army. No, that doesn't make sense, Ithrima said. Drow can't become vampires, and there's a mutual hatred there that runs deep. They wouldn't have let a vampire accompany them, and if anyone could spot a vampire, it would be a Drow. I wouldn't give the Drow in Lofin's army too much credit, Hino added. Heard they're dumber than the sticks they carry. Yeah, if there were any Drow that would get fooled by a vamp, it would be their soldiers, Rebus scoffed. Doesn't matter how it got here, though. That's definitely a bloodsucker bite. Nothing else with teeth like that has hands, and this kobold's throat was crushed like the other ones. Nobody said anything as we contemplated how a vampire bite could have ended up on the dead kobold. After a few moments of silence, Mako shrugged, and the rest of us took that as a signal to form up. Ultimately, Rebus was right. It really doesn't matter how it happened, only that it has. I glanced at Ithrima, knowing she would be crucial in the coming fight. Vampires are legendarily difficult to put down, pretty much have to burn the flesh right off their bones. Ideally, you'd ash the bones in the process. I assumed that the three in front knew how to fight vampires, then remembered an age-old saying about assumptions. So, has any of us fought vamps before? I asked. No, but I've been taught, Mako said. Pin 'em down. Let the mage burn 'em. It'll be easier if you stick Em and me or Hino lobs their head off, Rebus added. Then we put the bits in a pile and have Ithrima do the whoosh. Which leaves me with the task of filling the vampire full of enough arrows to slow it down enough for Mako to get his pike in deep. Good thing I brought the barb heads. Couple of gut shots or a lucky hit to the legs should do the trick. We continued down the dungeon, avoiding traps and piles of dead kobolds. Our footfalls echoed softly, almost rhythmically, but something was off with that rhythm. Mako held up his hand and we immediately stopped, readying ourselves for a fight. Here it comes, the big-ass orc said. I pulled back the string on my bow and moved to get a clear line of sight down the hall. I steadied my breathing and waited for whatever was running toward us to come into view. The sound of footsteps didn't stop and grew louder as we waited. Breathe in, pat, 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 breathe out, pat, 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 pat. Wait, pat, pat? Is the vampire barefoot? Before the thought could fully construct itself, a kobold came into view. Upon seeing us ready to tear it apart, it flung itself to the ground and threw up its hands. The sounds of its whimpers replaced its footsteps. No hurts, please, no fights, it said. Look, I got no pokies or slashies. I just a word bringer. The tension in my bow and jaw slackened at the same time. The tension in the rest of the party evaporated as well. I almost laughed. We'd been expecting a grueling fight with a vampire and were instead greeted by an unarmed kobold survivor. A word bringer? Rebus asked. What word do you bring, lizard? I not lizard, I kobold, it said stubbornly. I eat lizard. Aren't kobolds cannibalistic? Hino asked. Dunno that word. We're wasting time, the vamp could be behind it, I said. Speak, kobold, quickly. Yes, the Lord wants you to be word-bringers and tell the, shitty people that there are vampires in here. The kobold rose to his knees and looked at us expectantly. You mean city people? I said that. Wait, did he say vampires? Mako asked. As in more than one? More than I can count, and me count real good. The kobold nodded excitedly. Best counter, now that Thesis is dead. All the way to 7. The 5 of us froze. 1 vampire would be a hard fight. 2 would damn near kill us. 3 would guarantee a couple of us would die. More than 7 would mean that all of us would die and become vampires without even putting up a fight. Fuck that, Rebus said. Time to go. We all turned in unison and began to leave the dungeon. The patter of bare feet trailed after us. I turned to face the kobold as we continued to walk. The hell are you doing? I asked. Comin' with, the kobold said, as if it were confused by the question. The 5 of us looked at each other as we walked, and each of us took a turn shrugging. Yeah, all right then, I said. Come on.